Influencing popular culture, politics, and everything in between. The local station takes you ringside as we discuss the crazy world that is professional wrestling. This is Going Ringside with the local station.
Hello there, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Going Ringside. I'm your host, Scott Johnson. Glad you could join us this week. Excited about the topic we have today that I think no one ever really gives due diligence to analyzing this. Hope you enjoyed your WrestleMania weekend. Once again, if you're watching the podcast, liking the podcast, please share it with anyone you know who might like pro wrestling. If you're in any wrestling groups online, on social media, please let them know about it. Hope you enjoyed your WrestleMania weekend. Today, we are talking about the overlap of politics and pro wrestling. And there is some major overlap between these two worlds that I don't think there's enough credence given to. Like, it's incredible how much overlap there has been. So today we're going to analyze that. From Jesse Ventura starting it all out to a number of wrestlers running to two big issues that I really want to explore in depth. The link between the McMahon family and the Trump administration and the Trump run for presidency, for a re-election, as well as pro wrestling's impact on how Florida responded to the pandemic. If you remember, everything was closed down in 2020. All pro sports were closed down, NFL, NBA. But there was pro wrestling with crowds in Jacksonville. We're going to look at that coming up. I am going to do a second part of this episode that I will not cover today because I think it's its own thing that I would really like to explore on its own. And that is Dwayne Johnson, The Rock. I don't know if you're aware, but there have been a lot of articles really since Trump was elected because many people said, well, Trump was a celebrity, he was elected president. They think the same thing could happen with Dwayne Johnson. I think there's even been political polling on him done. And his TV show, Young Rock on NBC, is all about him running for president, I think, in the year 2032. So could this really happen? Well, we want to actually do a deep dive and find out if that's real. Could that be a real thing? Could The Rock, Dwayne Johnson, run for president? We'll explore that in an upcoming episode. But today, we're all about all the other politics that overlapped with pro wrestling, which has just been a lot. And it all started in the state of Minnesota. So this is back in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, with Jesse Ventura, who you remember very well, was elected governor of Minnesota. So how does this happen? So Jesse was a wrestler, pretty good wrestler, had a name for himself in the 70s, early 80s, but then health issues and an injury led Jesse to no longer be able to be a pro wrestler. So Vince McMahon decided to make him an announcer, something that Jesse turned out to be really good at. He was the lead color guy for WWE for many years. It was essentially Jesse or Bobby the Brain Heenan. If you hear people who were there at the time, they'll say Jesse was kind of just a hair above Heenan. I'm the biggest Heenan fan of all time, but Jesse was their main color commentator. He would commentate with Vince, he would commentate with Gorilla Monsoon. And what did Jesse do in the years he was doing this? He was essentially doing adversarial dialogue with his co-host, who was Gorilla or Vince. And he would sit there and he was the heel color commentator. He would root for the bad guy. And as he did this, he would just kind of be argumentative throughout the whole thing. And he became a very good talker. He had that deep broadcasty voice, and he was just very good. So like if Monsoon saying, I can't believe Honky Tonk Man would do that, Jesse would respond, well, Monsoon, what are you talking about? He was going to call BS on him and say, Hulk Hogan did that 5 minutes ago. So that was the type of thing Jesse was really good at. And he did that for many years. He was really good at it. He really learned and honed a craft of being able to have adversarial conversations on camera week in and week out. And by adversarial, I meant he was the bad guy, Gorilla or Vince or others were the good guy, and he did it for years. And what is that like? Being able to talk on camera, being able to have an argument over something happening in front of you, kind of similar to politics. and debating. And Jesse does this, and he does this in WWE, or WWF rather at the time, and then WCW for a while. He went there. He was a color commentator for Shivani, and he had kind of not a good relationship with Vince. I think there were some lawsuits involved and a lot of tension between WWF and Jesse when he left. So he goes to WCW, and then he leaves WCW, and he just kind of goes away. Now, Jesse was really the first wrestler to try and get into acting. Others had done it. Roddy Piper kind of had some B movies. I think Terry Funk had done a little, and a few other wrestlers. But Jesse was one of the first ones to get some roles in some A-list movies. He was in Predator, most famously, with Schwarzenegger, where he said, "I ain't got time to bleed," was his famous line. He was in more Schwarzenegger movies. I think he was in Running Man, Demolition Man with Sylvester Stallone. So these, while he had minor parts, were still A-list movies. So Jesse was really the first wrestler to get into A-list Hollywood. Now, Hulk Hogan did his own movies, but they never really were A-list. They were Santa with Muscles, No Holds Barred, things like that. But Jesse kind of made it a bit into A-list Hollywood. So obviously he had some ability to transcend wrestling. And he goes into politics, and I didn't really pay attention. I don't think a lot of people did, because he became a mayor of a city in Minnesota. Which, was great, and he obviously was honing his craft. And Jesse had a story, unlike a lot of wrestlers, that did well politically. Jesse Ventura was a Navy SEAL when he was younger. Navy SEAL is as good as it gets in the Navy. And you think about politicians who have really been able to use their military background. You think John McCain, Bob Dole, John F. Kennedy, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now, I'm not going to say he was General Eisenhower, but he was a Navy SEAL. And that brings with it a lot of gravitas when you're going into the political world to say, I served my country, I was the top echelon of the Navy. That really helps. So Jesse, in the late 90s, after he's been mayor, kind of comes out of nowhere. So his election was in November of 98. So he comes in as a third party. You've got a Republican, Norm Coleman, and Attorney General Hubert Humphrey III. They're going against each other as the Republican and the Democrat. He comes in as a third party, and he wins the thing. As he said, shocked the world, which he truly did, because he's a professional wrestler who was just elected governor. Now, Jesse really had a good political look. He wore his power suits. He was fully bald at this point, had a mustache, had that deep voice, and he was so good from his time in wrestling at just being combative, being argumentative, and winning debates. It was something he was just gifted at. Now, you can debate his politics. That's a whole nother story. But as far as his abilities as a politician, he had them innately. And he kind of upset everyone. And by upset, I mean shocked everyone that he did this, that a pro wrestler could be a governor of a state. Because consider what pro wrestling was prior to this. Pro wrestling was, I think Bobby Heenan once said, a step above roller derby. It wasn't really taken seriously. Now, this is the late 90s, when wrestling's becoming a lot more mainstream, a lot more popular, as Stone Cold Steve Austin becomes popular and more mainstream. And Jesse Ventura is elected governor of a state. That was a big shot in the arm for the industry. I think a lot of the performers thought, this really legitimizes us, that one of our former employees goes on as elected governor of a state. That was a big deal for the pro wrestling industry. And it seemed like any animus he may have had with McMahon was put to bed, because Vince brought him back to be a referee at SummerSlam 1999, which was Austin versus Triple H. Mick Foley got involved in that match. And I remember in the match, he punches Shane McMahon and says, "That's for your old man," in it. And he says, "I'm proud I was a wrestler." It was just good for the industry as far as giving them a shot in the arm, giving them a sense of legitimacy as performers who can maybe do something more beyond wrestling. Now, keep in mind, at this point, Dwayne Johnson hadn't really become a movie star yet, but they had someone who had gone on and become elected a governor of a state. So I'm not going to go over this yet until later in the episode, but this set off a string of wrestlers who went on to politics. Kane, Rick Steiner, Matt Morgan, who you might remember, Bob Backlund, Jerry Lawler, Rhino, Ric Flair, Booker T, Nikolai Volkov, all got involved in some fashion in politics after this happens. We'll go over those in a bit. But possibly the most impactful political thing was what happened around 2010. And I'm about to go into the Linda McMahon and the McMahon-Trump's links, as well as the impact of the pandemic in Florida and how pro wrestling may have really impacted how Florida responded to the pandemic, which is somewhat controversial nationally. So we're going to get into that. And after I discuss this, we're going to bring in a political commentator, a conservative talk show host here in Jacksonville, Ed Dean, who hosts the Ed Dean Show. Now, we're bringing him in because he knows two things very well. He knows Republican politics and what goes on behind the scenes, and he also likes wrestling. He's a wrestling fan. So I decided to bring him on to kind of analyze these two issues. So I want to start with Linda McMahon and the McMahon-Trump link because it's considerable. So Donald Trump was involved in early WrestleManias, some of the very early ones in the late 80s. He hosts them at Trump Plaza. And Vince and Trump essentially start to develop a relationship at this point that I guess lasted for many years. And then you might remember in the early 2000s when they had the hair versus hair match, and they bring businessman billionaire Donald Trump in against businessman billionaire Vince McMahon in the billionaire battle of the billionaires. And they had Donald Trump come down the ring. This is well before he's getting into politics and elected president. And he has Bobby Lashley as his wrestler, and Vince has Umaga. Stone Cold Steve Austin is a special guest referee. Trump tackles Vince famously. You can look it up on YouTube and start beating him on the ground. It was odd to see a president of the United States do that in his past. And he shaves Vince's head. So obviously they have a link. They are tight. Now, this is well before Trump gets into politics. So around 2010, the McMahons beat him there. Because when you think about wrestling, it was hard to envision someone going directly from WWE into politics because everyone kind of had a character. Austin, Rock, Foley, Triple H, Undertaker, they all had a character. Jim Ross had a character. Vince was a character. He was the evil billionaire. Steph, Shane had characters. They were the spoiled evil children of Vince. But there was one person in wrestling who never really looked like anything more than just a respectable, grown-up businesswoman, and that was Linda McMahon. They protected her when she was on. Now, granted, she was in some wacky angles, particularly with Trish Stratus and Vince pretending he was having an affair with Trish, and they had Linda catatonic in a wheelchair watching Vince make out with Trish. It was trash TV, I guess maybe you could call it. It was one thing, but it was very memorable, and Linda was in that. But despite that, they still kind of portrayed her, and she really did come across as a respectable grown-up, not involved in this crazy wrestling world, even though she was one of the owners with Vince. But she seemed like a respectable businesswoman. So that's who they decided to put forward for politics. And I always thought that Vince seemed like he wanted to maybe run for president someday because that was his image, that was his character in Mr. McMahon, this evil, maniacal guy who wanted to control everything, wanted to control the world. And that's kind of how he came across. But Linda decides to run. So she runs for Senate in Connecticut. Now, one of the things she has to do at this point before she can do that is she has to step away. She leaves the WWE. She's no longer affiliated with WWE in the role she had. And that probably made a lot of political sense because you can't have her running the WWE. That immediately politicizes WWE. They would become a political target, and she needed to be able to just focus on politics. So she runs for Senate in Connecticut as a Republican. Not an easy task. It's New England, it's the Northeast, it's Connecticut. It is a heavily Democratic stronghold. While there have been some Republican governors in the Northeast, Sununu, Mitt Romney up in Massachusetts, and others, and New Jersey had one. But still, running for Senate in Connecticut as a Republican, it's not an easy task. I wasn't sure if she could pull it off. And the McMahons dumped millions and millions and millions into this. And I remember when she was running, and all I could think of was like, how are the opposing candidates not running the old video of what Vince was doing with Trish Stratus and her in that love triangle storyline? How are they not putting that in all the ads against Linda McMahon that ran in Connecticut? I didn't live in Connecticut. I don't know what kind of campaign ads they used against her, but I remember Googling to try and find some of these more salacious, controversial things that happened in WWE, and this is before the WWE Network existed, on YouTube or Daily Motion. I couldn't find them. I couldn't find them anywhere. I didn't know if her political campaign before she ran said, you guys got to scrub all this controversial stuff off the internet. We can't have opposing campaigns get this. And I wondered if the opposing campaigns probably weren't wrestling fans. Maybe they were, but they may not have even known that this video existed, even though it was played to the whole country. So she runs, she puts a lot of money into it, and Vince, I noticed, they kept somewhat in the background. Vince kept very quiet. Obviously, if you get Vince involved in that, it's going to be a distraction. So it was all about Linda, and she lost. She tried, she lost. And I thought that was it, but there was another Senate seat in Connecticut available. A couple years later, she runs a second campaign. They dump millions again. She's somewhat established in Connecticut because people are familiar with the prior run. It's not unusual for people to run again for office. Trump's doing it right now. President Biden did it. Here in Florida, Charlie Crist ran for governor a few times. So that's not totally unusual. But she runs again. She loses again. And I thought, I didn't know how Vince would take that because he doesn't like to lose. But she ran for Senate twice. She lost twice. Granted, it was in a blue state. She was running as a Republican. That's hard to do politically. But I thought that was maybe the end for the McMahons' venture into politics. I thought that, and then Donald Trump was elected president in 2016, and that changed everything. Trump is in the WWE Hall of Fame. That's been somewhat controversial. Critics of the former president say that they don't think he should be in the Hall of Fame. I don't think that will ever change because the McMahons, who are close with him, own the WWE Hall of Fame. So I don't see that ever changing. But after Trump's elected, surprisingly, he has to pick a cabinet. Many times in politics, you pick people who are in politics or close to you. You also pick people who are close confidants and helped you in your campaign. And he put Linda McMahon on his cabinet as head of the Small Business Administration. There was a McMahon in the White House in a legitimate cabinet-level job. I don't think she was in the line of succession for the presidency. I don't believe Small Business Administration is in the line of succession, but she's still in the cabinet. There's a McMahon in the cabinet in the White House, which always fascinated me just from a wrestling perspective. And I think I saw some images where they went to visit former President Trump in the White House. And you have the McMahons. You have Vince, Linda, Steph, Triple H. They're all around the Resolute desk in the Oval Office taking a photo with the president. So it was interesting. And I always wondered how much influence the McMahons had behind the scenes on President Trump, on anything, because they were close. And I don't know how many people were closer to Trump than the McMahons, because when you think about it, they had that long relationship. She's in the cabinet. They're close. And I remember looking at Twitter during the Trump presidency at Vince McMahon's page and former President Trump's page. And Vince McMahon only followed a few people. He had millions of followers, but he only followed a few people. They were his family, a couple very high-profile wrestlers like The Rock and John Cena. He didn't follow many wrestlers, and he followed President Trump. And I looked at former President Trump's Twitter feed. He followed some high-profile politicians like Vice President Pence at the time, and his family, and Vince McMahon. I've always thought they have a very close personal relationship, and I always wondered how much influence the McMahons had. So Linda Lee, she quits her job with the Small Business Administration before his term ended in 2020, so she could go help be a bundler and a major fundraiser for the Trump 2020 campaign where he lost to current President Joe Biden. They became bundlers. They were very big financial backers of the Trump campaign, and you have to wonder if they're going to be involved in the current campaign for president with former President Trump now running for 2024. Obviously, there's a lot going on there. I'm not going to go down that road. But you have to wonder how much the McMahons will continue to be involved. The other political story I really wanted to talk about before we bring Ed Dean in to discuss this and analyze this is the pandemic in Florida. And some stuff that people overlooked that just bothered me as a wrestling fan. So you have the pandemic in spring of 2020 shut everything down across the country. In Florida here, they shut down schools. For a while, they were eventually reopened before many other states, and they shut down pro sports and a lot of other things. So you have football is in a bubble, the NBA is in a bubble, and they're still trying to do some games. It's canceled. It's a whole mess, as you probably remember, because you lived through it. But keep in mind, there's no off season for pro wrestling. If they don't play, they don't have a company. So they need to keep going. And NBA, NFL, they could probably absorb it a little bit. Pro wrestling doesn't have the finances of those pro sport leagues. So they needed to keep going, and they don't have the off season. So what happens in college sports is shut down too, high school athletics shut down. Now keep in mind, you have a major wrestling footprint in Florida. You have in Orlando, they have the Entertainment Center for WWE, where they started doing matches. And you may remember they would do them when these huge Zoom audiences behind them would just looked weird. It was like, I don't know, 500 fans on Zoom monitors watching and applauding these empty arenas. So you have that going on, and the McMahons are involved. They're obviously heavily involved with former President Trump. They are Republicans. Governor DeSantis is a Republican here in Florida. And I'm going to get to the AEW thing in a second because that's just as important. I want to bring up something Governor DeSantis said. Here in Jacksonville, we had a controversial thing going on here in the last year with some anti-Semitic flyers being displayed over a football game, being plastered on buildings. Governor DeSantis was asked about that. And you know what he called the people who did it? He called them jabronis. I couldn't believe it. I was like, did you steal that from The Rock or the Iron Sheik? The governor of a state is calling people jabronis. I think that indicates either he or someone on his staff is a wrestling fan to call these people jabronis. Not saying he shouldn't call them something, but the fact that he picked the word jabroni, a heavily well-known wrestling term, always fascinated me. So you have in Orlando a Republican owner of a wrestling company pushing to keep their product on TV. And around this time, there were headlines all over the place because the only businesses that could be open were called, quote, essential businesses. Fire, police, we in the media were considered that. They were called the first informers. Military, they were essential businesses. You know what else the state of Florida deemed an essential business? Wrestling. Pro wrestling was deemed an essential business. And if you Google that pro wrestling pandemic in Florida, you'll see a ton of articles about how idiotic is that? Why is pro wrestling an essential business during this pandemic when there's such heavy debate on what should be open and what shouldn't. So this happens with WWE, but keep in mind, there was another major player in Florida doing pro wrestling at the same time that the national press never looked at because they frankly didn't know it existed. That was All Elite Wrestling based in Jacksonville, owned by Shad and Tony Khan. They started their company in 2019, just about a year before the pandemic. So you start this major investment in Jacksonville, and then the pandemic's going to put you out of business? So what happens? Because this is right around the time AEW starts going on the road. They don't want to be in Jacksonville. They don't want to be they want to be touring to places like Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, which they do today. But back then they couldn't. The country closed. So what do? They pretty much own and operate, or for the most part own and operate, Daly's Place here in Jacksonville, which is the amphitheater connected to TIAA Bank Field where the Jaguars play. So what do? They start doing all their weekly shows on TNT, on AEW Dynamite at Daly's Place. Every week, Jim Ross is there saying to the country, welcome to Jacksonville for another episode of AEW Dynamite. And they were also here. So you have to wonder, as the governor and, leaders of this Florida state, which is a heavily Republican state as far as the leadership is concerned, in determining what should be open, you've got one of your owners of your 3 NFL teams running a wrestling company in Florida. You have a billionaire major Republican player with a pro wrestling company in Orlando. So you got to figure they have a little weight behind them when they are in touch with the governor's office saying, hey, you're going to put us out of business if you don't let us do our wrestling show. So they were deemed an essential business. And WWE for a long time was doing all their shows with no audience, and they were doing all these screens, these Zoom monitors in Orlando. They couldn't do it in Connecticut. They couldn't do it at Madison Square Garden. They couldn't do it in Los Angeles. They had to do it in Orlando. AEW was ahead of them, but because AEW doesn't have the brand awareness that WWE does, they didn't really get the national scrutiny. They were just able to go under the radar. I mean, we knew a little about it here in Jacksonville media, but no one really pays attention because it's wrestling. And AEW starts bringing in fans to the open-air Daly's Place. This is kind of a no-no everywhere. That was like, whoa. They're having fans. They're having crowds at their wrestling events. So when there was nothing going on in this country with respect to pro sports, there was pro wrestling with an audience in Jacksonville, Florida. The Khans were putting on a show. Now, they tell me, and I talked to them about this, they were doing the social distance, masking when it was needed, and they were doing the testing and all that stuff, which was big at that time. And they're doing this. And I remember we in Jacksonville here had a big UFC fight, and it was going to be at the Veterans Memorial Arena here in Jacksonville. They were going to have a large crowd, and everyone made such a big deal about this UFC event in Jacksonville. Can you believe this is going on? Wow, first big sporting event in the pandemic era with a crowd. That's unprecedented. And if I had hair, I would have been pulling it out. I'm like, no, that's not the case. AEW's had crowds for months over at Daly's Place. So that was just an interesting thing to me that AEW was able to pull off all these shows on national television weekly, and no one seemed to really pay attention from a structural media end. So I invited Ed Dean in to talk to us about this dynamic of both the link to the McMahons and Trump and the AEW and WWE being in Florida during the pandemic, still operating, because I wanted to get his perspective, both understanding Republican politics. He knows kind of the background of how maybe the Trump administration worked and the DeSantis administration, because that's his world. And he also knows wrestling pretty well. So I wanted to get his perspective on it. Guys, let's roll our interview with radio personality Ed Dean. Well, we are joined now by radio personality Ed Dean. Ed, we decided to have on because he is a conservative political talk show host, but he knows two things very well. He knows pro wrestling as a fan very well, and he also knows Republican politics. Ed, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, Scott, you're my man. Always good to be with you, bro.
Well, I want to ask you first about this McMahon-Trump link. I mean, it got to the point where he brought Linda McMahon into his cabinet. She's been a major fundraiser for Trump in his 2020 race and possibly, in his upcoming 2024 race. What do you take away from this McMahon-Trump link?
So let us go back. WrestleMania 4, Randy Savage wins the WWF Championship.
Yep.
Trump Plaza. WrestleMania 5, Trump Plaza. I mean, technically they were next door, but Trump sponsored all of these things. And some of the WWE events have been sponsored by Trump. So it goes back to 1988. That's where the beginning of all this takes place.
So the fact that, Linda runs for Senate in Connecticut, loses twice, but then were you surprised that Trump would put her in the cabinet? Because, it's wrestling and, people only take it so seriously, but they're close with the McMahons.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the Trump administration, you sit back, he went through like 30 people just for a couple of spots. So he was all over the map, but it's really based on loyalty, Scott. Linda McMahon, possibly when she ran, it was 2010, didn't have much of a prayer, but she had the best chance of anybody winning in that state. But it's more of a loyalty thing. They had done a lot of fundraising together. They'd done a lot of business together. And remember, Trump's Taj Mahals was also one of these areas where they had some of the WrestleMania, like, for example, some of the big wrestling event promos were at Trump locations. So I get it. Well, it's pretty much a loyalty thing there. I get it.
So when Trump was president, for fun, I looked at who he follows on Twitter. There were very few people. It was family and a few politicians like Mike Pence and people like that, and Vince McMahon. And then I looked at Vince's Twitter feed. He followed wrestlers and family, The Rock, John Cena, and President Trump. Do you think they talk?
Oh, yeah. Evidently, according to a couple of the reports, and for years, just one of my side hustles is love covering professional wrestling, is that they go back because they're both in that northern area. And we had Trump, Trump hotels. The best way of promoting it was always through main venues. Remember, the boxing matches even happened. Wrestlers used to go to boxing matches. Yeah. And then remember when Mike Tyson came in with Stone Cold and that Shawn Michaels match. Yeah. That was a lot that again intertwined. That was 1998 at WrestleMania. So Trump was also, again, it's that whole northeastern thing. And then if you go back, Trump and McMahon, they met, they connected because it wasn't that much difference, drive and business between the two. But remember, back in the day, the WWF was mostly a northern territory. Who lived there? Donald Trump.
Now, one other thing, if, Trump has had issues with people in his inner circle turning on him eventually, certain members of the cabinet eventually write books negatively about him or whatever the case may be. And that's an issue he's had politically. Do you think that the McMahon's loyalty is something that he really prizes?
It depends on what section. I mean, what's going on right now with New York? I don't think you can see anything with the McMahons. I mean, Vince just signed a new 2-year deal to get back with the WWE. I thought they were selling that. I think they're going to keep. Remember, Vince just got busted. Last year? Yes, paying off close to $15 million with sexual allegations.
Sure.
And I don't think he wants to get in there anything with that case going on with what Trump supposedly did or did not pay off anything with a sexual payoff to Stormy Daniels. I don't think the McMahons are going to get anywhere near that.
So I want to turn tables to Florida and what we have going on in Florida here. We had the pandemic, everything's shut down. And there was the huge debate that you covered intensely over, whether should we reopen or not. And DeSantis reopens a lot. And there was talk of the NFL, the NBA, but he declares pro wrestling essential business and took a lot of flack for it. Now, he's got the Cons here running AEW in Jacksonville. He's got WWE in Orlando. Do you think that behind the scenes that these two billionaires, the McMahons, the Cons, that he was trying to keep them happy in Florida?
Oh, yeah. I mean, dude, who was it? Lenny Curry at one of the big events when AEW was having bigger events in Jacksonville after all the pandemic. So Lenny Curry was there, and then MMA came into town. Yeah, I'll tell you, Scott, for years as a reporter, when they were looking to pass statewide taxes, they allowed certain exemptions or exceptions. 4 groups now you don't tick off are hair salons, barbershops, churches, and wrestling areas. Because why? That's where everybody goes to talk everything. You talk smack, you talk politics, and wrestling is just a big area. It's not like, I mean, go back to the 1970s and 80s where Jerry Lawler was in Memphis, Tennessee. The majority of those people, it didn't matter if they were black or white, were elderly men and women, not a bunch of young people. You remember that? So now it still adds on today. And a lot of these people, those people get out and vote. I mean, you can make close a football game or whatever, but professional wrestling just covers all political sides. And there's just some things you were not shutting down.
I saw Ron DeSantis recently when we had those anti-Semitic flyer issues around Jacksonville. I saw a quote from him calling the guys responsible jabronis, which The Rock and Iron Sheik made famous.
It's like you and I were talking. It's like shades of the Iron Sheik. Every time I watch the Iron Sheik anywhere do a televised interview, everybody's a jabroni. Of course, he always throws on a racial we don't want to go down that road, but yeah, but I wasn't going to mention that, but yeah, everything is you jabroni this, you jabroni that. I thought it was quite interesting that DeSantis did that. Maybe it was
he's a guy in his early 40s. You got to wonder he probably got that from The Rock, is my guess.
Or you think that, or and I see this because I'm a big fan of the governor, or somebody wrote it for him before he went out and made a comment. I don't know. You may be right about The Rock. Yeah,
it's possible. And I cut the interview there because we start going down the road of could The Rock run for president? I'm saving that for another episode. But I want to talk about, we talked about the McMahons. We talked about the pandemic in Florida. All the other wrestlers who have gotten in politics. Some I knew, like, for instance, Kane. He's the mayor of Knox County. But there's a ton I didn't know about. Like, I was kind of shocked by. So I just kind of want to go through them. Either they ran or they got involved in politics, just a lot. So Kane is currently elected. He's become a very hardcore Republican mayor of Knox County, Tennessee. He's the mayor there, and he seems to be popular. I mean, I only see Twitter feed. I don't live in Tennessee, but he's the mayor of Knox County, Tennessee. Rick Steiner of the Steiner brothers. He got elected to the Cherokee County School Board at one point. I don't know if he's still on, but he was on the school board. Matt Morgan. You may remember Matt Morgan. He was like the 7-foot guy on SmackDown, and then eventually went to TNA. He's the mayor of Longwood, Florida. Bob Backlund. Now, he had kind of a gimmick when he came back as the crazy Mr. Backlund with the suspenders that he wanted to run for president. Well, he did actually get into politics, and he did run for a congressional race in Connecticut, and he lost, but Bob Backlund got into politics. Jerry Lawler did. This is all after Jesse Ventura, by the way. So Lawler ran for mayor of Memphis, and I want to say either heard a Jim Ross interview or read it in Jim Ross's book when he asked him about going for Memphis, because Lawler was hugely popular as a wrestler in Memphis, so he assumed he'd be popular enough to be elected. But politics and wrestling sometimes don't always match up. He didn't win, and I remember Ross essentially telling him, "Are you crazy? You want to put yourself through that? That is politics is a blood sport, so to speak, kind of like pro wrestling, but in a whole different way. It gets very personal, and you put you and your family through that." In fact, I read that Jesse Ventura said the reason he didn't run for a second term in Minnesota was not because he didn't like it, was because it was just hurting his family, because politics is a tough industry, so to speak. Rhino, remember Rhino with his gore from ECW? He ran for a House race in Michigan and apparently lost. Ric Flair. Now, he didn't run, but he got involved in the 2006 presidential primary campaign of Mike Huckabee, who was the former governor of Arkansas. When he ran for president, Flair went out on the campaign trail for him. Booker T, he was considering running for mayor of Houston, Texas for a while. I thought that was actually going to happen, but he apparently didn't go through with it. And an old name, Nikolai Volkov. Remember the old Russian Nikolai Volkov? Well, he ran for a state delegate in Maryland, but lost. There's probably more. These are just the ones I found. But it's just interesting to see. I think all of these happened after Jesse Ventura. I think the wrestlers got a feeling that they can run for office, and they tried. Oh, one other that we've talked about on the podcast. This was a scam, but Tony Khan, who owns All Elite Wrestling here in Jacksonville, he thinks it was a wrestling fan. Someone forged his name and said he was going to run against Congressman John Rutherford here in Florida. That was fake and not real. Someone forged Khan's signature. So it's just interesting to see wrestling interact with politics in a very real way. And now the question is, in an upcoming episode, could Dwayne Johnson run for president? We're going to explore that as well. But this is our venture into the world of politics and pro wrestling. It's just a fascinating thing. There's probably a lot I'm missing, and we'll see if the McMahons continue interacting with former President Trump, seeing how that 2024 campaign goes. There's a lot of drama there we're obviously not going to get into here. But thanks for joining us. It was fun to talk about this subject here on Going Ringside with the local station.
This has been Going Ringside with the local station, brought to you every Wednesday on your favorite podcast player, on News 4 Jax Plus, as well as the News 4 Jax YouTube channel.